Hello, friends. So I'll be talking on this important topic, risks of mechanical ventilation. So this is a very basic topic. So I would be taking through the general risks that are associated with anyone who is intubated and mechanically ventilated. And it's good for all the trainees to have this concept in mind that anyone who is mechanically ventilated, it's not like there are no effects of the fact that someone is ventilated on different systems in the body. So we could approach this topic into two main broad categories. So one is obviously when you are mechanically ventilated someone, so it would have direct effects on the lungs. So that would be the predominant aspect. And most often we ventilate someone to have beneficial effects, but there can be a lot of deleterious effects if you are not able to put the modes appropriately or put the settings appropriately. And this could be barotrauma, ventilator associated lung injury, and there could be autopeep, cyclical atelectasis, heterogeneous ventilation, dead space, shunting, and diaphragmatic and respiratory muscle weakness, and mucociliary abnormalities. So all these are in broad some of the deleterious effects that can be caused directly by mechanical ventilation if we do not take care of certain settings in the ventilator. And in addition to the lung effects, so the mechanical ventilation per se has systemic effects on cardiovascular system, central nervous system, renal, splanchnic, neuromuscular, immune, sleep, and others. So these are two broad categories as to having direct effect on the lungs and on the other systemic effects. So this is a very important slide and picture for you to keep in mind. So there are two important pressures that really act, which determines as to how it may have deleterious effects on the lungs. So one thing for the listeners to bear in mind is this transpulmonary pressure. So this is terribly important, which really determines the risk of barotrauma, which is simply equal to the airway pressure minus the pleural pressure. So obviously we cannot measure pleural pressure. So the way we extrapolate and measure the pleural pressure is by measuring the esophageal pressure with the esophageal pressure monitor. And that would help you in ascertaining the transpulmonary pressure. And there is something called elastic recoil of the lung, which is the alveolar pressure minus the pleural pressure. And then you have the pleural pressure. So this is also another important pressures. There are two other pressures called pressure of the respiratory system. So pressure of the respiratory system is calculated by obviously the airway pressure minus atmospheric pressure. And there is a chest wall pressure, which is measured by the pleural pressure minus atmospheric. So these are the two important pressures one needs to keep in mind. But what is important for our intensive care is the transpulmonary pressure, which is a determinant of someone who may be at a risk of developing barotrauma, which is simply the airway pressure minus the pleural pressure. And this pleural pressure is measured by the esophageal manometry. So the pulmonary effects, as we said, the transpulmonary pressure can lead to pneumothorax. So if it goes up, there is an exponential increase in the risk of pneumothorax, which may lead to bronchopleural fistula and subpleural cyst, tension lung cyst. So all these are some of the complications that can arise with increase in the transpulmonary pressure. So this is just an image showing in ventilated patients, the typical pneumothorax that you would see, not necessarily may manifest. The barotrauma typically is due to the rupture of the alveoli with the air seeding into the pleural sheath, where you see a lot of subcutaneous emphysema and that's hyperlucent area. So again, a fact to be kept in mind that you don't see the typical classic pneumothorax that we would see. The barotrauma typically manifests with a lot of subcutaneous emphysema and with the hyperlucent areas. So there was this study which was done as a prospective cohort study in 5,183 ventilated patients, and they put up the risk estimation of barotrauma at around 3% in ventilated patients. And some of the identified risk factors which act as a trigger or increases the risk of barotrauma, as we all understand, someone who has an underlying COPD, asthma, or who has a stiff lung, CLI, ARDS, or someone who has interstitial lung disease, or your ventilatory setting, which has led to increase in the plateau pressure, which will come to it. So we clearly understand plateau pressure is a very important determinant of someone having a higher risk of barotrauma. So if your plateau pressure is more than 30 to 35, so obviously the risk starts going up. And another important thing that the science or the studies have found is the PEEP is a good thing, and the PEEP and the recruitment that you would do the optimal PEEP, what we say, is not necessarily a risk factor for barotrauma. So there is more emphasis on volume and the settings that you would have kept, and not keeping the plateau pressure within acceptable levels is an important risk factor. So PEEP per se, the optimal PEEP, what we say is the buzzword, and the recruitment measures which are done in the right way is not shown to be a risk factor. And this came from the Cochrane review, so which basically took a lot of studies and found that PEEP per se is not a risk factor, optimal PEEP. So what are the clinical features of barotrauma? Obviously, when there is a barotrauma, there's a lot of subcutaneous emphysema and ventilation gets affected. So they would get tachypneic and there could be chest pain. But typically these are ventilated. You would see manifesting with the tachycardia, tachypnea, hypoxemia, and hemodynamic abnormalities. They could have hypotension, or initially they can have hypertension and then eventually they can have hypotension because of the barotrauma. So on examination, in anyone who has barotrauma, so you would have a lot of subcutaneous emphysema, and the features is you would see Hammond's crunch, crepitus in the skin, and hyperresonant note. So investigation, obviously you have to image these patients to ascertain whether there are hyperlucent areas in these or a frank pneumothorax, which needs to be addressed. So now question comes as, how do we prevent this barotrauma? So there are two pressures that we have understood. So we know that transpulmonary pressure is a pressure that we need to remember, which is a difference between airway pressure minus the pleural pressure. So they have tried to look whether singularly the airway pressure, does it lead to a risk in barotrauma? So it is shown that airway pressure per se by itself is not necessarily a risk factor, but high airway pressure leading to increase in the plateau pressure, so P-plat more than 35 definitely has shown to increase the risk of someone developing barotrauma. So why do we say that the airway pressure independently may not be a risk factor? That came from this particular study, which is quite a big meta-analysis of 14 randomized controlled trials by the French group with 2,270 patients, where they showed airway pressure independently is not a predictor of barotrauma. And this was confirmed by other older studies, multiple studies that came from the US. So, but this meta-analysis clearly showed that singularly airway pressure may not be a risk factor of someone developing barotrauma. Rather, it is more the plateau pressure. If your plateau pressure is exceeding 35, so that is a clear indicator that they are at a much higher risk of developing barotrauma. And then the question arises, when a patient develops barotrauma, does it have a bearing on the mortality or morbidity? So these are all the studies that has very clearly shown that someone develops a barotrauma, the risk of mortality is very high as compared to the patients who do not develop barotrauma. As you see, 51% versus 39, 66 versus 46, 46 versus 39 in all these studies. And even the ICU length of stay increases when someone develops barotrauma. That goes without saying, and duration of mechanical ventilation also is longer. So all in all, to say that someone developing barotrauma, it has a direct bearing on increasing the risk of death and mortality. So now we'll move to ventilatory associated lung injury. So again, this ventilatory associated lung injury is again directly related to increase in the transpulmonary pressure, which again is a difference between airway pressure and the pleural pressure. And it is a ratio of tidal volume delivered divided by tidal volume received. What that means is you have certain lungs which are adequately ventilated, and there is this non-functional units of the lung which are not ventilated adequately. And what this leads to in ventilator associated lung injury is there can be a lot of sort of a inflammatory exudate collection in the alveoli, and there can be hemorrhages that can develop in the alveoli, and there can be hyaline membrane formation and surfactant loss, which eventually leads to collapse of the alveoli, leading to worsening or perpetuating of the lung injury. And then there is an entity called cyclical atelectasis or tidal atelectasis or atelectotrauma. So here where the key essence of this whole cyclical atelectasis, you have certain areas of the lung which are collapsed, and then there are certain areas of the lung which are over distended. So previously in valley, we saw there are certain areas of the lung which are optimally ventilated, and then there are non-functional areas of the lung or a collapsed alveoli, which leads to increase in the transpulmonary pressure. But in cyclical atelectasis, you have collapsed versus over distended alveoli, and because of the opening and closing of these over distended alveoli against the collapsed alveoli leads to shear forces, which leads to cyclical atelectasis. And the risk factor for this is tidal volume more than 6 ml, or someone who is acidemic, who has restrictive lung disease, and someone who is receiving transfusions. All these compound the whole problem of this atelectasis, and genetic factors also do play an important role. So how do we prevent the whole ventilator associated lung injury and the cyclical atelectasis? The key essence which we have understood by multiple studies of lung protective strategy is to lower the tidal volume, to keep the tidal volume less than 6 ml per kg, and most importantly, try to keep the plateau pressure less than 30 centimeters, which together will help you in reducing the cyclical. And another important concept, along with lowering the tidal volume and reducing the P plat, optimal PEEP also becomes very important. And it has been clearly shown that increase in airway pressure does not equal to increase in the lung volume. And you have various ways of ascertaining the PEEP optimization based on the inflection point and deflection. So your optimal PEEP should be somewhere between this. And beyond the deflection point, obviously there is a risk of barotrauma. And now there is a whole concept of driving pressure, which is again P plat minus PEEP. So we have clearly understood how important it is to reduce the tidal volume to keep the plateau pressure less than 30. Along with it, it is very important to determine and ascertain that the PEEP is kept at an optimal level, because together they lead to reduction in the driving pressure, because the recent NEGM studies which came around 3-4 years back has clearly shown how keeping the driving pressure low by tweaking the plateau pressure less than 30 with the tidal volume, and by optimizing the key PEEP will help you in keeping the driving pressure less than 15, which is again very important to make sure that your ventilation is adequate and the risk of barotrauma is mitigated. So this is something which has to be kept in mind, anyone who is ventilating the patients. So if you want further elaboration on this, obviously this topic, what I'm talking is more on risks of mechanical ventilation. So this I have spoken in 2 other lectures before. You can visit uh, my website and go through those. Now we'll move into auto PEEP. So auto PEEP also is an important complication of ventilation if certain settings are not put appropriately. So the causes for auto PEEP is if your minute ventilation is very large, and if your patient is very tachypneic, obviously then adequate ventilation will not be happening, or if you have increased the inspiratory time or time constant inequality, all this leads to auto PEEP. So what is auto PEEP? Auto PEEP is where there's not enough time for the air that has gone in to come out because of possibly the airway resistance that is remaining, that is prevailing, or the limitation in the exhalation process due to the whole disease process. It may be a COPD where you have a natural inability of getting the air out that has gone in. And all this leads, or if you have put your inspiratory time high, or if your ventilatory settings is erroneous in these patients, so this can lead to auto PEEP. And how do you determine auto PEEP? So you can look into the flow time. So you would see the expiratory curve not touching the baseline, and that clearly indicates that there is an auto PEEP. Or you can put a expiratory hold in the patient after complete relaxation, and that would give you the auto PEEP that may be evident. And you can even look into your flow volume loops. So this is the expiratory one. As you see, it is not touching the baseline here. So this clearly indicate to you that there is an auto PEEP building up in the patients. So is auto PEEP something that is alarming, one should be worried about? Yes, the auto PEEP is something that one needs to be worried, because it can worsen the hemodynamic status, it can cause hypotension, and even if auto PEEP is large, it can lead to sudden cardiac arrest. And auto PEEP, because there is a buildup of over distension, or there is buildup of gases in the alveoli, it can lead to barotrauma as well. And estimation of mean airway pressure and static compliance when there is a auto PEEP becomes erroneous or inaccurate. So these are some of the effects of auto PEEP. So one should bear in mind that auto PEEP is not good for hemodynamic status. And I'm sure most of the listeners would have realized that in COPD, where you have a big auto PEEP, so hypotension can be very troubling, and you need to fix this auto PEEP even before contemplating on other measures to fix their hemodynamic instability. So how do we treat auto PEEP? So there are 3 ways that one would look at in addressing the auto PEEP, the first most important thing is obviously adjusting your ventilatory settings. So as I said, because there is limitation in the exhalation of the gases due to the underlying disease process. So the most important aspect is to increase the expiratory time. So give more time for these gases to come out and a decrease in the respiratory rate, because if you increase the respiratory rate, your expiratory time gets shortened. I'm sure all of you would be aware of this, and that would obviously limit your exhalation process and decreasing the tidal volume. These three are an important ventilatory settings one should bear in mind when you're ventilating COPD patients, especially that we need to increase the expiratory time and reduce, because IE ratio is very much dependent on your respiratory rate. So if you increase the respiratory rate, then the expiratory time comes down. So you increase the expiratory time, reduce the respiratory rate, and reduce the tidal volume, because your minute ventilation determines, your increase in the minute ventilation does determine auto PEEP. So you have to reduce the tidal volume. And the second important aspect is, if someone is a COPD, try to reduce the carbohydrate intake, because that can lead to CO2 buildup. Reducing the dead space. So if you have any pleural effusion, any collection or a pneumothorax, so that has to be drained and shortening the tube and shortening the the ventilatory circuit. So all these go a long way in reducing the dead space. And the third important thing one needs to bear in mind is someone who is very anxious, who is not fully sedated, and someone having fever. All this can contribute to the auto PEEP, and these things have to be addressed. And patient has to be compass mental and settled, because all this can lead to worsening of the auto PEEP. And the third aspect is obviously your auto PEEP increases when the ET tube that you have used is a smaller one. So using a larger ET tube and avoiding a lot of secretion buildup and using bronchodilators. So these are the three important dimensions for trainees to bear in mind. One is the first top one is the most important. So you have to reduce the respiratory rate, increase the expiratory time, reduce the tidal volume. The second aspect is to reduce the dead space. If you have effusions, if you have pneumothorax, or if your ET tube is large or the circuits are very long, all this can help in reducing the dead space. And in COPD patients, trying to limit the carbohydrate intake, and obviously avoiding the pooling of secretions and bronchodilators. So this is the in broad the things that needs to be addressed to treat auto PEEP. And this is a very constantly debated question as to what is the PEEP that one needs to set in when there is an auto PEEP. So some say you keep a low PEEP, some say you keep PEEP above the auto PEEP. So if auto PEEP is 10, try to keep 11. So the consensus is the safest way to approach this is try to slowly increase the PEEP to keep it about the level of the auto PEEP. So that would be the safest. So application of external PEEP nearly up to the level of initial PEEP seems to be appropriate and much accepted. So we spoke about WALI, and we spoke about auto PEEP as a complication or as a pulmonary complication of mechanical ventilation. Then we talk about heterogeneous ventilation. This I'm sure all of us understand the concept of baby lung, and even anyone who is intubated and ventilated, it is not like the whole lung is equitably ventilated or uniformly ventilated. So there are certain areas. So always the apices are well ventilated. And this is a picture of a PET scan, which clearly shows in someone who is mechanically ventilated. So there is a very heterogeneous distribution of ventilation with predilection of more the baby lungs or the apical lungs getting more ventilated than the bases, which we clearly understand. And we know the ventilation principles, it is very much dependent on the flow, resistance, and the PEEP and the compliance. So these are the elements which clearly determine the homogeneity of the ventilation. So if you have intubated and ventilated, we know for sure that there are areas of the lung which are diseased and they're not as adequately ventilated as the normal lungs. And that is what is called heterogeneous ventilation, which remains the norm in anyone who is intubated and ventilated. And when someone is ventilated, it is not like the dead space that is prevailing is optimized. So because there are areas of the lungs which are well ventilated. You see this alveoli which is well ventilated, but the perfusion may be defective because of the whole pathologic process that may be underlying. So, and that would increase the dead space component. So ventilation is happening adequately, but perfusion is not happening. And that creates increase in the dead space, which affects the ventilation. And there's a concept of shunt fraction, which gets increased, where perfusion is happening adequately. As you see, some of the alveoli are ventilated well and some of the alveoli are not ventilated because of the disease process, and that leads to the shunt fraction. And that is also an important complication or the result of a patient who is on a mechanical ventilator. And whether patients on ventilator have effect on the diaphragm and respiratory muscles, it has been very increasingly recognized that the diaphragm progressively gets weaker and there is a disuse atrophy. And this was a study done in 2008 where they assessed the contractility of the diaphragm in 22 patients, and they stratified patients who were ventilated for more than 18 hours and less than 3 hours. As you see, the twitching or the contractility of the diaphragm significantly reduced in patients who were ventilated for a longer time as opposed to someone who was ventilated for a shorter time. And it has been shown in the autopsy also, there is significant atrophy of the diaphragm that sets in someone who is mechanically ventilated, and there is a proteolysis process also that happens at a cellular level in diaphragm. So clearly we have understood, even now we are using ultrasound as a tool to determine the diaphragmatic contractility as a tool to determine the weaning process as to why certain patients have difficulty in weaning. Because of the fact that diaphragm gets weakened, contractility gets weakened, there is atrophy, there is proteolysis, which all in all leads to difficulty in weaning. And this we have clearly understood now, and we have ultrasound tools to ascertain and determine as to how weakened the diaphragm has got. And another important aspect, so why do ventilated patients develop VAP? So this is a question we keep asking ourselves. Despite all the infection control measures, we know the intubated mechanical ventilated patients are at a much higher risk of developing VAP, because it is clearly shown the whole mucociliary transport goes for a toss and it gets affected. So we have evidence. So this is a very old study where in Germany, where they've done a technetium 99M scan in 9 patients, and they look at bronchial, BTV is bronchial transport velocity. And they found the bronchial transport velocity, the movement of the mucus, almost becomes zero in patients who develop complication as compared to the ones who do not develop complication, which means to say your whole mucociliary movements and the transport of the secretions get terribly affected in patients who develop complications on a ventilator. So these are all the effects that in brief of ventilation on the lung that develops. So most important aspect for listeners to bear in mind is the barotrauma and the transpulmonary pressure, which is airway pressure minus the pleural pressure, which is an important factor which determines someone who's at a risk of developing barotrauma. The second important aspect is to take measures to reduce VALI, ventilator-associated lung injury, and atelectotrauma. And the essence for that is to lower the tidal volume, and keeping the plateau pressure less than 30 desirably goes a long way in and optimizing the PEEP. So these are the 3 entities one should keep in mind to reduce the risk of VALI and the cyclical trauma. And the third important aspect we touched was the auto PEEP. And for the auto PEEP, so there is a disruption in the exhalation process. So the ways to address that is to increase the expiratory time and reduce the respiratory rate, lower the tidal volume, and reduce the dead space, and reduce the secretions, and you can reduce the anxiety, fear, or the fever process or restlessness, which also contribute, and reducing the carbohydrate load in COPD patients using large size tubes, ET tube, and reducing the length of the tube. So all this go hand in hand to in reducing the auto PEEP. Then we spoke about diaphragmatic effects of ventilation and mucociliary transport. So that is the effects on the lung. So let's move to the systemic effects. So I'm sure most listeners would have understood. So kindly watch my video on heart-lung interactions in ventilated, where I have elaborated more on this. So anyone who is on a positive pressure ventilation, this is a nice diagram. As you see, reduces the cardiac output because there is reduction. Once a positive ventilation is happening, there is a reduction in the venous return, which obviously leads to drop in the cardiac output, and you can have hemodynamic disturbance. So what are the hemodynamic effects? So the beautiful thing about positive pressure is it has a favorable effect on hemodynamics parameters. On right heart, it has some effects. On left heart, it has some effects. One important thing is it reduces the venous return. And for the right heart, it increases the right heart cardiac output and it increases the afterload of the right heart. But on the contrary, this is very important. This I have elaborated in the heart lung video you can watch on my YouTube or on my website. But on the left side of the heart, it reduces the cardiac output and reduces the afterload also. So that is something which we need to bear in mind. And these hemodynamic effects are also quite dynamic in nature. These are very pronounced where chest compliance is lower, as in fibrothorax, and it is very pronounced where there is increase in lung compliance like emphysema. But the hemodynamic effects are less where where the opposite prevails, where there is increase in the chest compliance as in sternotomy, or where there is reduced in the lung compliance as in ARDS and LVF. So this is the in very brief as to hemo. So right heart, it increases the cardiac output and increases the afterload. Left heart, it reduces the afterload and it can reduce the cardiac output. But this effect may not be pronounced. This reduction of the left heart cardiac output may not be significant, especially in patients with left ventricular failure and pulmonary edema or ARDS patient is what we understood. It is more pronounced in emphysema patients. So now very briefly on wedge pressures. I know we are not using much of pulmonary artery catheters and pulmonary artery. In very brief, positive pressure ventilation has a bearing on pulmonary artery occlusive pressure, and you have to adjust it for the PEEP. So this is transmural filling pressure is pulmonary artery occlusive pressure minus half of the PEEP. But where compliance is low, like in severe ARDS or stiff lungs, you have to adjust this with pulmonary artery occlusive pressure minus quarter of the PEEP. And the correction is done by calculating this index of transmission, which is change in the pulmonary artery occlusive pressure divided by change in the airway pressure. This I have elaborated again in a trainee tutorials in the hemodynamic monitoring. So kindly watch those videos. I'll be telling very briefly that positive pressure ventilation has a bearing on the pulmonary artery wedge pressure, and that needs to factor in the correction factor, which is the index of transmission. And the correction is done by end expiratory pulmonary artery occlusive pressure minus PEEP into index of transmission. So this is the adjustment that we make for the abnormalities that prevail in the lung due to reduce in the compliance. So you go through the video in my hemodynamic in training tutorials. There is a hemodynamic monitoring where I have elaborated in detail about cardiac output and pulmonary artery catheter. So we'll move to the whether mechanical ventilation has any effects on the gastrointestinal system. Yes, we know that someone who is mechanically ventilated are at a higher risk of stress ulcer prophylaxis and GI bleeding, and they are at a risk for developing esophagitis. And they do develop little alteration in the liver enzymes. AST can go up and LDH can go up. And long-term ventilated patients are at a risk of developing acalculous cholecystitis. So all these are documented sort of a complications which are independent to mechanical ventilation. In renal, someone who is ventilated are always at a higher risk for AKI, and it is shown ventilated patients, the odds of developing AKI is 2.11, and they are significantly at a higher risk of developing AKI. And the mechanism is, we understand, reduce venous return, reducing the renal blood flow, reducing the cardiac output, increase in the interleukin 6 production, increase in the tone of sympathetic nervous system. All this puts them at a risk of developing AKI. In CNS, if the settings are not appropriate, if the PEEP is very high and someone has a brain edema, it has an ability to perpetuate the worsening of brain edema. So what about neuromuscular? So we clearly understand someone who is mechanically ventilated are at a higher risk of developing critical illness myoneuropathy. The reason why they're at a risk is because of the sedations that we use, because of the analgesics, because of the neuromuscular blockers, and because of the steroids. All these compound the risk of someone developing critical illness myoneuropathy. And there are studies, this is a good study which came in Lancet, 104 patients, where they've emphasized how important it is to keep the patients who are ventilated physically active. So you see if someone is mobilized within 72 hours who are on a ventilator as compared to someone who is just left like that, your functional status independency is much higher in someone who is actively mobilized and there is some sort of a physical activity that happens in someone mechanically ventilated. And now I'm sure many listeners you would know that there is something called cycle ergometry where patients do exercise even when they're on ventilator. So it's just an emphasis that they need to some sort of an active range of movements and passive range of movements need to be happening to improve their functional status improvement when they come out of the ventilator. And this is a study which again looked into the immune system, and it is shown in, it was a small study done in 44 patients where they found that increase in the tidal volume and the non-optimal PEEP led to higher production of all these cytokines, interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6, interleukin 1R, tumor, as opposed to the group which had a protective lung ventilation with lower tidal volume and optimal PEEP. So again, re-emphasizes how important it is to optimally keep your ventilatory settings, because we understand this is common sense that cytokines and interleukins, all this would go up because high tidal volume and non-optimal PEEP will lead to ventilator-associated lung injury. And we saw ventilator-associated lung injury leads to edema in the lungs or edema within the exudatory fluid in the alveoli and hemorrhage in the alveoli and hyaline membrane formation. All this obviously would lead to increase in the cytokine formation. So sleep disorders are something that can develop even in patients who are on a ventilator, obviously, and even after that. And it is determined by the severity of the disease, and appropriate treatment of this delirium and sleep disorder is very important in someone who is mechanically ventilated. How do we do that? And again, it's a whole topic in itself, reducing the alarm sounds and creating a day-night diurnal sort of a variation and all the other, and maintaining silence in the whole environment. So all this go a long way in reducing the risk of delirium. And even music has shown to be helpful in reducing the risk of this delirium. And increased insulin resistance has been found in someone who is mechanically ventilated. Someone who is in a on ventilator are at a higher risk of developing venous thromboembolism. And I'm sure every listener would know that anyone who is ventilated mandatorily have to be on venous thromboembolism prophylaxis or DVT prophylaxis, because they are at a moderate to high risk of developing VTE. And so this is another important aspect. Someone who is on ventilator, they are at a much higher risk of developing malnutrition or sarcopenia, muscle loss. So there are separate talks I've given on the role of protein optimization in these patients. So it is very imperative that we optimize their nutritional status and avoid the muscle wasting or sarcopenia that develops. And another important thing which we face in ventilated patient is the risk of developing pressure sore. So I'm sure every good ICU would have processes in place to prevent this pressure sore, and avoiding development of pressure sore is an important quality indicator, and preventing and every patient being on thromboprophylaxis is an important quality indicator. So I'm sure most good ICUs adopt these strategies, have pressure relieving mattresses to prevent or avoid these complications in ICU. So all in all, these are the systemic effects where in summary, we spoke about the hemodynamic effects, and we spoke about the GI effects, we spoke about the renal effects, we spoke about the neuromuscular effects, and then other ancillary aspects like the insulin resistance, sleep disorder, and these things. So thank you all. So I would end with this very sad depiction of our profession in this day and age, where we take a lot of efforts in advancing the spirit of science by constantly deliberating on the scientific aspects. And then we have these situations where non-literate people belittle our science and talk very lightly of the science, and which has a tremendous bearing on increasing violence on our community. So it's a very sad note. I think this picture has to be kept in mind as to how easily certain non-educated or non-intellectual people belittle our profession. So thank you all. So you can visit my website www.drpradeeprangappa.com to rehear to this lecture, or you can visit my YouTube channel. So thank you all.